You're listening to the Whole Church Podcast, a proud member of the Anazao Podcast Network. Our efforts to educate and unite the church are made possible thanks to our sponsors on Patreon, Captivate, and Apple Podcast. You could join them on one of those networks, or you can support the show by making a one-time tip on our Captivate website down below in the show's description. Matthew 11:7-11 in the New American Standard Bible. As these disciples of John were going away, Jesus began speaking to the crowds about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing are in the king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, Behold, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has none arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet, the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Here, the author has Jesus speaking about John the Baptist. After Jesus had just assured a group of John's followers that Jesus is the Christ. He said, I am the Christ. John was kind of questioning. He had some doubts. He needed some reassurance. Jesus was like, put his doubts to ease. But then Jesus went on to make some really great claims about John and stated that the least in the kingdom is greater than he. James McGrath, so what do you think Jesus meant here, and what is the kingdom of heaven?
Let me back up even just before that passage that you read, because you mentioned the possibility that John had doubts and that his question from prison reflected those doubts. And that's one possible way of understanding John's question, but it's something that results out of the way that the Gospel of Matthew in particular has added to and edited its source material, right? In the Gospel of Mark, which is our earliest Gospel, Jesus goes to John to be baptized and is baptized by him, and we don't get that moment of recognition, right, that we get in the Gospel of Matthew, where John the Baptist says, I need to be baptized by you and you come to me. And so it's because Matthew has added that this question from prison then seems like he's faltered in his recognition, right? But in actual fact, right, without that framing, that earlier recognition that Matthew has introduced, I don't think we'd understand it that way, right? And so I think it's possible that it's less an expression of doubt and more a question of the timing, and also maybe even an invitation to step into that role. Because Jesus is continuing to do the kinds of things that John did, is not yet enacting judgment. Prophets, when they predicted anything, but often when they predicted judgment was coming or something like that, doesn't mean they were eager for it to happen, right? And so if it's happening in a short time frame, that also could make John think, wait, doesn't the people get more time? Isn't this, And so I think there are a much wider array of possible ways of understanding the question than as an expression of doubt. So then Jesus has this response and lists some things, makes reference to a passage in Isaiah and echoes it, and drops out one detail. And this also a lot of interpreters think might be significant. Mentions, the blind seeing, those who aren't able to walk being able to walk, drops out any reference to prisoners being set free. And so it's also been suggested that this is essentially a sort of a coded message between John and Jesus. It's like, hey, are you the one who's going to come, who's going to set the prisoners free? Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, know what I mean? And Jesus is like, yeah, I'm the one, and getting you out of prison is not going to happen, right? And so that's an interesting possible way of understanding that as well. And so then when we get to this statement of Jesus about John, right, he's more than a prophet. He's one, right, and the echo is, of language that's found in Isaiah, but also in Exodus, right, where we have this figure who's going to lead the people to the promised land, right? And so this and he's saying that John is more than a prophet, the greatest human being who ever lived, right? That's what those born of women means, right? Those born of women are human beings. And so then you get, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than him. And I find it hard to believe that Jesus gave John the best compliment ever and then immediately took it away. And so I think the least in the kingdom of heaven either has to be referring to, when the kingdom fully dawns, the least in it will be greater then than John is now. Or saying something like, those who get to see the kingdom dawn have a privilege that John doesn't, right? John ends up being executed and so misses out on seeing the things that are going to happen. And so it would be a bit like, and I say this in my book, be a bit like saying, Moses was the greatest prophet who ever lived, and yet the least of those who entered the promised land is greater than him, right? It's not downplaying Moses so much as saying, and even so, as great as Moses was, there are things that you have the chance to experience that Moses missed out on. So I think that this is a really important passage in terms of understanding sort of Jesus' view of John and the relationship between the two.
Man, and I'm sure we're going to get more into that soon. Good teaser. Hey everybody, welcome to the Whole Church Podcast, possibly your favorite church unity podcast, possibly not. Usually, this is where I'm like, I'm Joshua Nolan. I'm just here to introduce the greatest podcaster of all time, TJ Tiberius One Blackwell. But he is sick. However, he jumped on before we could record just because he wanted to talk to one of his favorite guests. He was so excited. This is like full endorsement by your favorite podcaster, the one and only Dr. James McGrath is joining us today to talk about John the Baptist, his recent books, and whether there's a difference to the biblical John the Baptist and the historical John the Baptist. James, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm so glad TJ popped on. Yeah, he was sniffly. He didn't sound too good, so I think you made the right choice to sit this one out. But glad I got to say hi at least.
Yeah, he's making some hot tea and trying to feel better now for you guys next week. But yeah, James, we know through connections with Theology Beer Camp, had a lot of fun there. He wrote a Lord of the Rings song for part of a liturgy this year. We had a lot of fun with. I've actually spoke to you one other time on a different podcast, and we talked about Doctor Who. For Systematic Geekology. So people want to go over to the YouTube and check that out. We had a lot of fun with that too.
So can put this on display here as well to make sure we get.
Yes. John the Baptist next to the TARDIS is.
Yeah. In fact, put TARDIS next to John the Baptist, and that's like today's.
That's all. Yeah, that's all they need to know. Oh man! So really excited to get into this. I have to try and remember TJ's parts here. So guys, make sure you check out the other shows that are part of the Linus Podcast Network. I mentioned Systematic Geekology. Some Joyful Noises has some stuff going on this month. My Seminary Life and Kung Fu Pizza Party with Brandon Knight's also a good one this month. He's got some fun stuff going on over there. So check out some of the other shows. Link in the show notes for the network website. Also, if you don't feel like doing the subscription thing, at the beginning of the episode, we're like, oh, hey, you can subscribe and support us on Patreon or, whatever. You can also do a one-time donation at Captivate. If you just don't feel like doing the subscription thing but want to support the show, you can do it there. That link, I think, is also in the show notes. I should know because I write the show notes, but I never remember what's down there. I just don't. But with that, James, I like to start every show off with the holy sacrament of perfect unity through silliness, because you can't be divided when you're as silly as I like to be. And today was specially chosen for our guest. Today's silly question: which doctor from Doctor Who would you bring with you to Middle Earth if you could? I can answer first, give you a little bit of time to think about it.
Okay.
I wouldn't bring my favorite doctors. Like I'm thinking of David Tennant, Capaldi, and the second Doctor, whose name's forgetting me right now. But those are probably my favorite. But I feel like they're a little too serious. Middle Earth is already serious. I might actually bring Tom Baker. I feel like that would be fun. Or Pete Davidson. You get one of those sillier doctors. I could see Pete Davidson actually with the celery in his pocket. We're just walking around Middle Earth, checking out some hobbits. James, what about you? Which doctor? What are you doing in Middle Earth even?
Right. I mean, part of me wants to say Sylvester McCoy just because it's like, he's already there, just in disguise. Yeah. But that seems like you just can't do that one, right? Because it's too close. So part of me wants to say Patrick Troughton. Go back to the really early days, just because he. Yeah,
that's who I was thinking of. That's my second one. The second Doctor. I love him. He's so good.
Then again, we could have if there's going to be some, first we have to figure out, is this like a parallel dimension, or is this like actually earlier in Earth's history? What is this? How is he getting there? And all kinds of stuff. and then figure out, who are the companions going to be? Is this going to be a multi-doctor episode? Where we could really,
I know I don't want Rose Tyler. I know that. I like Rose, but nah. I don't want that kind of drama. Middle Earth doesn't need that.
Different parallel universe.
Yeah. Oh, man. Good stuff, though. Good stuff. So you're going Patrick Troutman and questions up on which companions we're bringing with us. But we definitely know K9's coming. We know that.
That could be interesting.
All right. Well, with all that said, we can get out of the silly part, even though I think we could do a whole episode on that because it's a fun idea. But,
I could.
we have some of the normal whole church stuff that we like to do. And one is like we've learned that it really helps people with Christian unity to kind of hear one another's story. A lot of times we jump to labeling one another and, this means you believe this. And we kind of like do the whole division, tribalism thing. But hearing one another's story kind of takes down some of those walls, I think. So would you mind sharing with us some about your faith journey and just kind of like how you get to where you are now in the Christian walk, I guess?
Sure.
I'm trying to use less churchese, but I don't know how to say that otherwise.
Say it again.
I was trying to use less churchanese, but I was like, I don't know how to say that otherwise. So it is what it is.
So, I don't think you didn't use the word testimony, right? So there you go.
Yeah, I did avoid that.
So I think you're fine, right?
Okay, good.
You are asking about church, and so slight churchiness in the way the question is worded is probably acceptable.
Oh.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Catholic Church, and in my teens went into this seeker phase, was trying to figure out what I believe, wasn't sure, believed in God, was not sure beyond that exactly what that would mean, was wondering, what's real, what's not. And got invited to a concert at a friend's church. It was a Pentecostal church. And it was really the music that kind of spoke to me. I had already encountered some, contemporary Christian music. I don't think we were actually using that label at that point. And just had heard some people singing about their faith, their relationship with God, things like that, in a way that sounded real, much more real than anything I had experienced, and sounded like what I was looking for. And this was a local college radio station, had like an hour of Christian music, I think on a Sunday night or something like that. And I used to just flip through stations trying to discover new music, all this kind of, very into music at that point. Nice. So I was still very into music, but at that point, that was what really connected with me. I think this story might have unfolded very differently had it not been for music's importance in my life. So anyway, at the concert, the same thing, people singing, about surrender to God and other things in a way that sounded very authentic and personal. And so, the next morning I just sort of cried out to God, had a lot of confusion, as people often do in their teenage years, and just said, my way of living is not working. I don't know what your way is, but whatever it is, I want to try it, and felt this sense of peace come over me. And so for those who need the churchy labels, it is essentially a classic born again experience. And so immediately sort of shifted gears from thinking, I might do something related to music. Anyway, it had this mishap in gym class where a basketball had bent back my finger. And so music was starting to look a bit iffy anyway. And so started thinking about Bible college, ministry, other possibilities, was not sure what I should do, but said, okay, I had this experience. I want to explore, I want to learn. And so ended up going to Bible college. As probably those who watch and listen will know from their own experience, if you do academic study of the Bible, a lot of the assumptions that may have led you to study the Bible in the first place get challenged. And that happened for me as well. But because this experience, that I'd had in my teens was the foundation and not like dogma that I had inherited in church or something like that, needing to rethink doctrines, needing to rethink how I viewed the Bible was actually less threatening. And so I understand, and hopefully, when people who've come by a different route find this much more challenging than I did. But at any rate, while I was at Bible college, also met the woman who is now my wife. When we were both students, she was very persuasive that actually I'm probably better at teaching than preaching or other types of stuff. And that led to me getting a PhD, going and teaching in Romania for a few years. And she was Baptist. And so I've settled in Baptist tradition. That's for those who may not know that there's more than one kind of Baptist. If you've only encountered Southern Baptists, you may have this sense that it is a fairly narrow and rigid denomination. But I've settled in the American Baptist churches. And so much broader denomination.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I just realized earlier, because I've become familiar with you. We've talked a few different times. I don't think I mentioned you are you have the chair of New Testament language and literature at Butler University. Is that right?
So yes, I'm the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair, New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University. I'm also the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the moment, and I'm also involved in my church, both involved in music and also teach Sunday school class. And so,
nice.
Those are some things about me that might be useful for.
Yeah. Sure. I should have mentioned some of that earlier, but I was like, hey, I know.
Get in later. No problem.
Just get into it. Yeah. No, but man, the language and literature stuff is some of the most fascinating stuff, and I'm sure we're going to get more to that when we talk about John the Baptist. But you mentioned as part of your, I won't say testimony, some of the music is kind of like what really shaped some of that story. Are there any specific songs that you remember that really like clicked with you?
Yeah. So I actually heard some like Michael W. Smith and stuff like that. But there was actually a Brian Duncan song, All My Life, which still kind of is meaningful to me. But yeah, then at that concert, it was this local band. I think they were bilingual, did songs in Spanish as well as in English. But at this concert, it was just in English. But they just sang a song, I Say Yes, Lord. There was that sort of surrender. Yeah. And I think that's really been sort of foundational to me, and that's sort of the core of my journey, is that, I had this life-changing experience as a result of surrendering, not as a result of affirming certain dogma or something like that. It was really about sort of putting God first. And when that's how your faith is configured, how your spirituality is configured, however you want to put it, that actually is, I think, very freeing, because precisely by putting God first, says it's not only okay, but maybe even necessary to rethink things, right? If you're going to grow and mature in your faith, if you're going to explore, if you're going to learn, if you're going to seek the truth, then you should be questioning things, right? Because, I remember this shocking moment when I was talking with someone from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was not my own viewpoint, and assumed they're these terrible heretics. And the person gave his testimony and talked about the Holy Spirit and things like that. And I was like, wait a minute, you're not supposed to say that. That's our line, that sort of thing. Yeah. And so when you realize that, to the extent that getting your beliefs wrong can be detrimental, at least in terms of, how you value others and other things, taking that seriously enough to question and to, put your beliefs to the test is actually an expression of faith, right? It's so striking to me that what a lot of people mean by it's so striking to me that what a lot of people mean when they say faith is actually, it sounds a lot more like doubt, right? It's clinging like without questioning, without letting anything into your, to challenge your beliefs. That's what you do when you are in panic mode about things that you think are so, are such a house of cards that, any slight wind of, fresh air coming into the room could bring the whole thing down, right? And so faith should mean trust in God, not affirming dogma and shielding it from question. Yeah.
No, man, I got a lot of thoughts with that. No, I think a friend of both of ours, Aaron Simmons, he writes, faith is risk in a direction. And that's like one of my favorite lines. I'm like, yeah, it's even, it's the, that moment. I can't remember who it is who comes to Jesus is like, yeah, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. It's like I'm not sure all the time, but I'm willing to risk my life in that direction because I think it's something worth risking for. I love that language. And then even the surrender thing, because that kind of gets tied up with, and we have listeners from all kinds of denominations and backgrounds. We have some more conservative Christians, some more progressive Christians who listen to this. I find myself like near the middle, probably more progressive on a lot of stuff, but yeah, it changes. It depends who I'm talking to. Some people I'm like, I'm super conservative compared to what you think, but it just depends who you're talking to. And I think for me, I call I've started calling myself more of like a Christian Taoist, really, because I don't think of God as like the big guy in the sky. I kind of think of it as like the rhythm the universe is a part of, which also kind of is Tolkien-esque, but we'll get to that later. So, you know, I like the surrender language still, even though like it has that vibe of like some of the stuff I used to believe that I don't necessarily believe anymore, because, you know, it's just kind of the language that they use. But also that's kind of it, right? Like if God is kind of just the rhythm that the universe is in, it's like, well, yeah, surrendering to that rhythm, kind of getting into the flow of what is good. Yeah, it's good language. I like it. I'm a
fan of Taoism as well, and you know, think that you know you can learn a lot from it without even, you know, as a Christian, there's plenty you can learn from other traditions. I think in general, you know, even if it's just reinforcing your own beliefs because you're like, well, no, that I don't think that way. But Taoism is one that I think really has a lot that's compatible, because it is about engaging with the world, navigating life in the world in a way that, you know, is balanced, right? And that, you know, balance is a major theme. Doing so sort of non-violently, and yet also in a way that is not passive either, and just being tossed about by everything that happens, but being, you know, the Tao Te Ching uses this imagery of water. You know, water can wear away a stone, right? You know, it's powerful, and we often don't think about it until we get it in large quantities. So yeah, big fan of Taoism, and you mentioned it, and so I was like, yes.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, even it's like, you know, Tolkien, and a lot of Christians especially, but you know, in America, kind of we get like siloed off, and we think only certain kinds of Christianity exist. But even Tolkien believed everything was created good. That was like his own biggest problem with his own work was the orcs, because he's like, no, he genuinely believes everything was created good, and if you believe that, then that kind of Taoist model makes a lot of sense. Of like, well, if everything is created good, the most good I can be is the most me that I am, you know, like really discovering who I truly am if I was created good and leaning into that. Yeah, but that's, you know, that's for our Taoist podcast. We don't have that yet, but one day.
If you ever decide to do that, you can, you know, I'll happily be a guest and we can talk more about it. And can connect it with, you know, sci-fi fandom, you know, because the whole theme of the Force in Star Wars, another one where it
was just ripped off of Taoism directly.
Yeah, and I mean, you can take it in more of a what we might call a Zoroastrian or Manichaean way, right? Of, you know, the light and the dark are, you know, good versus evil. But in Taoism, light and dark are both necessary parts of life, and what's good is balance, right? And you get that language of bringing balance to the Force. And if the Sith are going too far in the direction of aggression, the Jedi, you know, go in a, you know, are stifling love and connection and other things, and are going in a different direction. And, you know, the whole story ultimately, I think, is about finding that balance and recognizing that, you know, being fundamentally good, which is what you were talking about, you know, in how we're created, is not about, you know, not having, you know, instincts to, you know, to eat and to survive and to procreate and things like that. Mm-hmm. It's about finding balance and, you know, healthy expressions for these things. And so, yeah, I think, you know, Taoism, Star Wars, you know, wherever you learn it from, there's lessons there.
Yeah. And in a lot of those beliefs, it's not like light and dark isn't necessarily good and evil, you know, it's more like you might think of anger as dark. Well, Jesus had anger, you know.
Yeah.
And God created all those things in us for a reason. And, you know, again, another podcast, but we will do it one day, because I see that me and you would have a lot of fun with it. So I think we at least got to do an episode one day.
Sounds good.
Yeah. But you did mention that you're currently with the American Baptist Church. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
What could you tell us? Could you tell us anything about that? Or like what makes that church unique compared to some other expressions maybe?
Sure. So it's Baptist, which means, and again, if you've experienced other Baptist traditions, you might be surprised that one of the defining features historically has been congregationalism, you know, and an emphasis on soul freedom, so that ultimately, you could still get kicked out, but ultimately, you know, doctrinally, theoretically, you are the one responsible. It's you before God for what you think and doing what's right, you know, and you should follow your conscience. And then individual congregations as well, right? And that's why you have the talk of Baptist unions, that it's actually, in theory at least, a collection of churches, each of which its autonomy is recognized as part of this larger thing. And yeah, I never get tired of pointing out that the American Baptists are the ones that the Southern Baptists broke away from, because the Southern Baptists wanted to keep their slaves when the national denomination, the National Union of Baptists, had taken some steps towards abolitionism.
Yeah. I church unity, but I do pick on the Southern Baptist a lot. Maybe too much, because I have some friends who are Southern Baptists, and I love them dearly. But as an organization, I just have a lot of issues.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to note the history behind that. That not just what I mentioned, but also even so, it was moving more moderate and had moved in a sort of a more balanced direction.
They were all for abortion at first.
Yeah, and there was essentially a coup, right? They made a concerted effort, the conservatives did, to take over the seminaries and to shift the denomination in the direction that it now leans, right? Which includes using the same approach to the Bible that was used to justify keeping people enslaved, now to justify excluding women from ministry, for instance. And so, I think that there's something there, not to pick on the denomination, but certainly to note that there's a history of interpreting the Bible a certain way in order to justify something that members of that denomination would now recognize as abhorrent, namely enslavement of others. And even though they would say they've changed their mind about what they did using that approach to the Bible, they're still using that approach to the Bible in relation to other issues. And I think that's important to note.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I'm a weird breed of human. Sometimes I listen to stuff that I know will make me angry because it fuels me to still care. I don't think anger's always bad. So I regularly listen to Al Mohler's morning show. Not every day, because I can't handle it that often, but every now and then. And not too long ago, whenever the United Methodist Church finally voted to be affirming of same-sex marriage, he almost exactly, his words were, this is what happens. You start by letting women do ministry, and then you start affirming gay. I'm like, that is the most slippery slope argument I've ever heard. It's like, what is happening? But that's their institutions right now, And I was on another podcast. This might be a little divisive, but when I say Christian unity and I talk about church unity, to me, the first thing is that we are Christian, because we can't be united if we don't agree with what that means. And I think you can pretty clearly say some things aren't Christian. Excluding people is not a Christian thing to do. Supporting a rapist for president is not a Christian thing to do. So, I'm like, some things just aren't Christian. So we're talking about Christian unity. Let's start with what's Christian and then worry about the being united thing. And that's where I struggle. I have a lot of people who are in Southern Baptist that I think genuinely are Christian. And I love them. But then, as an organization, you're talking about the autonomy thing with your church that I actually think is a really good thing. I like it. But what the Southern Baptists have done in the last few years is they use that excuse to not get rid of ministers who have been abusing women. Then turned around and, what are you talking about, autonomy? No women ministers ever. So autonomy here, when it's something that you want to not look at, it's something you don't like, all of a sudden, no autonomy.
Yeah, it's like the claim to be taking the Bible literally. When it's inconvenient, it goes out the window. Right? So.
Yeah. Whenever you point out the Bible doesn't agree with itself here, then it's all of a sudden not literal. Interesting. But we won't harp on that too much. What we will do, though, one last thing before we get into John the Baptist, this is kind of a fun game that we do. It's our speed round. It helps people kind of get to know you better and what some of your beliefs are. So the rules are, I'll ask you a series of questions. You have to answer in one sentence or less, and I cannot ask any follow-ups, which is why TJ usually does this part, because I'm really bad at not asking follow-ups. You think you're ready for it?
No, but let's start anyway.
Same. All right, here we go. Number 1, who or what is God?
God is the ultimate reality, that which is most transcendent, that which has always existed and encompasses everything else.
All right, okay. Which atonement theory do you most closely hold to?
None.
What is the significance?
I will add is not a follow-up, but which doesn't mean that I don't have ideas about atonement, but I'm not sure there's a label that could be stuck on my thinking.
That's hard not to ask follow-ups to, but here we are. What is the significance of baptism in the Eucharist?
As a Baptist, I will say that baptism is a way of indicating one's decision, but it means different things for different denominations. I certainly respect that, and I'm not sure that the modern Baptist understanding is, for instance, what Paul thought. He seemed to think that it generally mediated something more mystical. And I think of the Lord's Supper as something that, the way it's practiced now is really mostly focused on the death of Jesus. But I think that the ancient church practice, which I would love to see more of us incorporating into our communities, had more of a connection with Jesus' practice of table fellowship across boundaries and things like that. And so I think that the gathering for a meal, right, was much more central in the early church, and that hanging out and eating together, right? I mean, maybe that is a Baptist thing, right? The potluck is the real where it's at.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay. What authority does Scripture have?
Scripture connects us with foundational moments and with the past of our tradition. And so it does not provide definitive answers in the sense that we can never argue with it. It embodies a conversation where we sometimes see the authors of Scripture disagreeing with one another, and we see developments over time. And so it invites us into a conversation. We need to still be conversing with it and engaging with it if we want to claim to be part of the tradition that those scriptures represent, but not in a way that stifles the need to explore new avenues and express our faith in new ways in the present.
I can almost see you like visualizing that sentence. You're like making sure this is just one sentence still, but I'm going to get everything in. That was good.
You talk to a professor and they're going to be like adding this nuance.
I can make a long sentence. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. That's why I was like, I can say there was a semicolon after none, right, with the atonement thing, and then
I was envisioning it. I was like, that was good. That was a well written verbal sentence. What authority does tradition have?
Much the same, in the sense that it's harder to notice, right? When something is in a text, we see it as words on the page. When it's tradition, it's there all around us and we may not notice it, but ultimately it's part of our heritage, and there's no reason to simply throw it out just because it's tradition, but it's also good to re-examine it and to challenge it from time to time.
Yeah. I'll change up a little bit. What's your take on glossolalia being practiced in the church today?
Having come through a Pentecostal church, I think it's fascinating, and I do not have strong views on the subject one way or another. I have not tried to persuade the Baptists in my community to engage in this practice, but it's clearly something that can be an authentic and meaningful part of one's spiritual life and practice.
Yeah, I like that. Can God change?
Yes.
All right.
That was the period.
What do you love about the Bible?
It is just so fascinating and so engaging, and it's not a problem to be solved, right? Which is what it often is for fundamentalist religious believers and fundamentalist atheists. But when you realize what these texts were doing within the context of their own time, when you realize that there's structure, there's creativity, there's vibrant imagery, there's humor, there's just so much to love. There are stories that I love that include Jonah, the book of Job, things in the Gospels. I'm not sorry that I have chosen a career path that has me talking about the Bible, thinking about the Bible, reading about the Bible, writing about the Bible pretty much every day.
Yeah. Oh, man, good stuff.
Run on sentence.
What do you love about the church?
At its best, it's a community where we can be authentic and honest, and yet be held accountable to our stated goals and values, and can uplift and encourage one another, can challenge one another, and we need that.
Yeah. All right, last one. Which, if any, of the 7 sacraments do you follow? I have them listed if you want me to read them off.
Go ahead and listen. I'll give you a chance to think.
Okay. I have baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, penance, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders.
I probably would have forgotten the last one if you hadn't reminded me. Church history is less of a field that I've gotten into, and Baptists are not so big on those other than the Eucharist and baptism. And so those are the ones that I'm connected with denominationally. Being married, I also have a connection with one of the other ones. And so maybe we'll leave the list at those 3.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. We don't despise the others, but
no, not as well. That was a follow-up, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, now the speed round's over. Oh, man. So you mentioned during the speed round, and then earlier we're talking about like some of the fundamental stuff, and you talked about the conservative coup that kind of took over the Southern Baptist Church, and I just want to do a quick little side notes on some of the stuff of how that Genesis story way early on was not interpreted literally. Like you go back to Augustine and it's like, yeah, there's no way that would literally happen in Genesis 1 and 2. Like it wasn't like evolution came along and we were like, now we got to do something with this. We've always had to do something with that text. And the fundamentalist like documents in America, like back before Southern Baptists were a thing, included one writer who was a creation evolutionist. So we're like, how much is like some of the stuff you're like, I don't know about that.
Yeah. The fundamentals, right? There was that publication that gave fundamentalism its name, right? And it was a much more intellectually engaged movement, right? Connected with like Princeton Seminary at that point and things like that. But young Earth creationism, like the age of the Earth, that kind of stuff was not one of the fundamentals then, right? And so this is a very recent thing to focus on that. And one thing I love pointing out is that for the ancient Christians wrestling with Genesis 1 in particular, they argued that it can't be literal, not because they were trying to squeeze in, other scientific things, although that did happen at times in the history of theology, but because they said creation in 7 days, taking it literally, demeans God, who doesn't need 7 days to create, right? God can create instantaneously. And so this has to be a picture for us, right? And so it's fascinating how through a very different line of reasoning, they reached the same point, right? And so people will say that young Earth creationism is the historic view of the church. And I mean, that's not true even factually, but to the extent that there were people who assumed that the Earth was young, it was an assumption, right? It was not a point of dogma. And that's the problem with a lot of today's selective literalism, is that it's rejecting something that the church has always done, that we see biblical authors doing, which is saying that sometimes as our knowledge of the natural world changes and develops, as a new cosmology comes into the picture, we need to change and update our language. When Paul talks about the third heaven, right, and you get these multiple layers of the heavens, that's the worldview of, that was in force in that time, right? The Greeks pioneered, where you get the multiple spheres around the Earth with the multiple planetary, right? And so it's still geocentric, right? But you don't get that in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And so across the pages of Scripture, we can see them updating in light of what people are thinking, and yet expressing their faith in the context of the cosmology, the view of the universe, the view of the world that they had in that time. They're not trying to say, well, because I'm a follower of Jesus, therefore I can tell you secrets about physics that nobody else in our time knows, or something like that.
Yeah. See, I just have so much fun talking with James. We haven't even got to like his book yet. We're so far into this. But no, if you want more on the cosmology stuff, Ilia Dilio writes a lot about that, and she's just fantastic. Absolutely worth reading. Last note is just kind of like what we're getting at really just kind of boils down to the church's stance on abortion right now was not always the church's stance on abortion. The way we interpret Genesis, that was not always the way we interpreted Genesis. The list goes on. The stuff with like women not being pastors, that's also fairly new. Like early church had women ministers. So it's kind of like, you got to, when you say you're a traditionalist, a lot of times you really mean that you believe a lot of stuff that came up in the last few decades and you're really holding to it for some reason. But for that one guy out there who's like, wait a minute, Augustine did believe in a young earth. He did. But he got there because he interpreted the Bible figuratively, because he was like, there's no way that these genealogies are right, because then the earth would be way older than it is. He was just wrong. It happens. But yeah, so there we are. We got that out of the way. You've written 2 books on John the Baptist. So you've written Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. And then more recently you wrote John of History, Baptist of Faith, The Quest for the Historical Baptizer, which sounds like an epic Star Wars type movie that someone needs to make. What's drawn you to study this character of John the Baptist so closely? Like, what allured you to him specifically?
Yeah, I think John the Baptist has been on my radar for a while. Those of us who do a lot of writing, anything, whether it's music, whether it's academic publications, anything, people who preach lots of sermons, you do enough of it and you forget how you got started along a particular path or when you got interested in a particular topic. But my doctoral work, right, back at very early on in my academic career, was about the Gospel of John and how Jesus is depicted in it. And although I didn't focus on it at that time, had a brief mention sort of in the final chapter about the fact that another topic that one could talk about in the Gospel of John's portrait of Jesus is how Jesus relates to John the Baptist. By learning about the history of academic study of the Gospel of John, I learned about a group called the Mandaeans, and they are essentially followers of John the Baptist, and they're still around today. And it was suggested that they might have some connection with the historical John the Baptist by a different route than Christianity, and so might be useful. And that was a widely held view, and then became a view that nobody held. And so I found my way back to being interested in their texts, teaching about post-New Testament, early Christianity, and some of the things that were labeled as heresies, like Gnosticism. And so took an interest in them, realized that these texts are fascinating, possibly relevant to our understanding of figures like John the Baptist, and not being studied. Some of them not even translated into English in their entirety. And so worked on a project related to one of their texts known as the Book of John, and that's John the Baptist, not the Gospel of John, like the New Testament one. And I knew once as I was working on that the next step had to be, how are these texts relevant to the New Testament, and in particular the figure of John the Baptist? And so that's essentially the route that led me to pay attention there. Working on the historical Jesus, writing a book on what Jesus learned from women. Somebody actually asked me when I was doing an interview, I think it was with Times of Israel, the person asked me, so what's next? What Jesus learned from men? And I was like, actually, yeah. So.
Oh, man. The Bibles are so like interconnected. So it's always fascinating how people get to specific things. So you mentioned you were looking at the history of Jesus. I always get fascinated in this, like the differentials that people might make between like the historical Jesus and the real Jesus, which is what I want to do with John the Baptist, because you hear that a lot about Jesus, but you don't often hear that discussion around some of the other biblical figures. Have you read Zealot by Reza Aslan?
I've dipped into it, but it became clear before I had a chance to read it that it was somebody who, from outside of New Testament studies, returning to a view that had been given due consideration and was no longer found really plausible. And so, I'm aware of it and have taken a look at some of the things he says in it, but have not read it from cover to cover.
Gotcha. I don't know how serious I take it, but as far as just like writing, it's well written. Like, it's fun to read. Mm-hmm. So I remember C.S. Lewis talks about he did not like some of the studies of the historical Jesus, because he was like, I feel like some of this historical studies gets us away from the biblical Jesus, and whether it's historical or not, that's what matters. How do you address those kind of questions of like, before we even get to John the Baptist, like in general, does it matter that we know the real history versus the Bible story of it?
I think asking about history is important. It was Marcus Borg who said that the Jesus that he discovered, which he viewed as essentially a peasant philosopher, and I don't hold that view, but by digging into the history, he found that it forced him to realize that the actual Jesus who lived roughly 2,000 years ago is not easily conformed to our time, to our doctrinal system, to our imagination. He says he'd much rather a middle-class Jesus who drives a Mitsubishi, right? And that was, I'll never forget that phrase, right?
Yeah.
And so historical study, one of the things it can do in service of faith is prevent us from simply making Jesus whoever we want him to be. And I think that is something that even people who have some qualms about historical study can hopefully appreciate, because we have people laying claim to Jesus, claiming to be followers of Jesus, who have diametrically opposed views of what that means. And if we can't ask about evidence in sources from the past, and obviously even a literary approach to these texts, it needs to be historically informed, right? Otherwise, whether it's historical reconstruction or imagining a historical figure, or imagining the meaning of text, we're going to distort them unless we bring the tools of historical inquiry and historical evidence about the time and place that they're from into the picture.
Yeah. Do you mind if I stay on some of this kind of like meta-analysis of like history for a second? Because what you brought up there kind of makes me think of like what happened with Bonhoeffer, and really relevant recently with the new movie, where people will take his writings and they might interpret it different ways, right? But then by looking at the history of Bonhoeffer, it's really clear what he actually meant. Is that kind of like the same thing that you're saying? Like a lot of like the New Testament is more commentary on Jesus and like the theology, and understanding that like underlying history kind of helps find a foundation for that, so we know what they were actually interpreting.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true as well. I mean, if we think about whether it's Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., there are these figures who become iconic, and therefore everybody wants to say, oh, I appreciate this person, and they know a few quotes, but they may not know sort of the whole and the context of the quotes, and so may end up having a completely wrong picture, right? They may truly believe it, right, based on what they've heard, but they may have a totally wrong picture of what that person actually said, or may just have a partial picture. And so asking, what's the trajectory that goes from John the Baptist through Jesus to Paul and the Gospels and later Christian theology, to the extent that we're trying to figure out how to express faith in a meaningful way in the present, looking at and understanding the process, and not just the results of the process, understanding the history behind and not just the stories within these texts, can play an important role. That can at the very least be helpful, if not indeed being essential.
Yeah. No, I like that. That makes sense to me. I was just trying to like reword it for myself so I can like wrap my mind about what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, that was a great analogy.
I had another thing that, again, this is just kind of more that meta level of like history versus Bible kind of stuff. Richard Friedman, do you know any of his work? Yeah. When he's writing about Exodus, one of the things that he made a statement of that I found really interesting is that he finds it kind of problematic how we do some of this like history research stuff, because he thinks a lot of times what scholars will do is they'll ignore the Bible and say, well, this is history and this is all that matters. But he says if it happened the other way around and we had all this archaeological evidence and stuff, then we found the Bible, we would absolutely use that to interpret what this evidence is. Do you see any of that in like scholarship, where like maybe sometimes we ignore the Bible and if we had found it later, we wouldn't have?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's an important place for historical investigation, and any archaeologist will tell you, any historian will tell you that when you have artifacts, you have structures dug out of the ground without texts to make sense of them and tell us, and provide context and interpretation, it's hard to make sense of it. It's hard to know what's going on there, right? So having both is important, and asking, how much does this text like reinterpret what happened in light of later things, is also crucially important. But there's no obviousness to saying, well, we should just look at what the archaeology says and only look at texts in a secondary way, or to say we should only look at the texts and should try and resist any interpretation of archaeological evidence that doesn't fit those texts. Most historians, I think, would be trying to find the balance, recognizing the texts are always written later, and so archaeology sometimes gives us stuff from the actual time that can and should shape and sometimes reconfigure our understanding. But texts should not be ignored, ever. But I think also, one of the things you were hinting at is that the texts provide us a story, right? And whether you think the Bonhoeffer movie, whether you think that Reza Aslan's Zealot tells the story accurately, reading it, watching the movie, taking it on its own terms, understanding it as story so that you understand, what is this person doing? Why is this happening now? Why is this book or movie being made now? We can do the same thing with the Gospels and say, okay, going to set aside for now the question of, do they start out in Bethlehem and then end up in Nazareth, or do they start out in Nazareth and then can he fit these two stories together in Matthew and Luke, and just say, okay, what's the story Matthew's trying to tell here? What's the story Luke is trying to tell here? And appreciate it as such. And so I think there's an important place for that should not be neglected. And the fact that I do a lot of work on history rather than on sort of literary approaches, hopefully doesn't keep me from doing that as a reader of the biblical texts.
Yeah. But while we're on it, Merry Christmas, everybody. And would you agree that Jesus was almost definitely not born in Bethlehem?
That's very hard to say, but okay. What I will say is that he's known as Jesus of Nazareth, which would naturally mean that he was born in Nazareth.
That's what my thinking is.
Yeah. I mean, Saul of Tarsus, right, apparently grew up in Jerusalem and was educated there, and he was known as Saul of Tarsus, right? And so, but what we can say quite clearly is that we have two infancy stories that, despite the pageants that smush them together, really don't fit neatly together. And so in one of my books, I encourage readers to trace the geographical movements, do it on a map and see what happens.
Yeah. Another place where that literalism might not work. But anyway, we need to talk about John the Baptist. It's just, I get stuck on anything. And I'm talking to James, I could just talk about pretty much anything. We could just go forever. But we both have lives, it turns out. So John the Baptist, Baptizer of History. That's your more recent book. It just released in October. Specifically, what was the inspiration behind digging into the historical stuff more with John the Baptist? Because I know you kind of already did a little bit in your other book, but you decided that wasn't enough.
Yeah, so the two books, Christmaker is a biography of John the Baptist. And I wrote them both simultaneously. It was an intentional effort to offer a general audience accessible, big picture life of John is complementary to the big academic book, because oftentimes an academic study, a collection of deep dives into questions about the historical Jesus, doesn't tell you how you fit these things together into a picture of his life, right? And so I want to do the same with John the Baptist and offer the big picture and also offer the kind of detailed, in-depth studies that academics want. And, if an academic reads Christmaker, they're going to be like, okay, but what's the, how does he deal with, what's the evidence, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so John of History, Baptist of Faith, some people will get the allusion in that, right? There was this longstanding expression and distinction made in New Testament study between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And so, I was echoing that, saying John of History, Baptist of Faith. And that book is about the use of Mandaean sources, right? Can we do that? Should we do that? Was Jesus a disciple of John the Baptist? How does baptism get invented? And what was its significance? And what were aspects of the ritual and the practice? Things to do with prayers attributed to John the Baptist. And so it's the big book is a series of in-depth, detailed studies of some key topics. And it makes some, I think, genuinely innovative suggestions, right? We get this movement known as Gnosticism popping up in some sections of early Christianity, but also in some forms that are not Christian. And so it looks like it happens in the circles around John. And I try to offer a plausible historical reconstruction of how that might have happened. And so I've said more than once that if I'm bound to be wrong about stuff, but if I'm right about any one of these things, then the book was worth writing because it'll make a useful contribution to our understanding.
Yeah. And Jesus clearly thought he was important from the verse we read earlier. So if he thinks he's important and you're going to say you're a Christian, he's probably important. Man, I just have so much for here. So you mentioned some of the big questions, prayers to John the Baptist. Where did baptism start? There was the other one that I really wanted an answer to that you said first. My brain's blanking.
Was Jesus a disciple of John's?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you going to answer any of those for us, or are you going to make us read the book? Or both?
If I were wise, I'd probably make you read the book. But there's a lot more to it than a short answer, right? I mean, when you did the speed round, right, there's so much more that could be said about any of those topics.
Oh, man. Yeah.
But it does seem that, historically speaking, Jesus joined John's movement, right? And we have reference to disciples of John the Baptist, right? And Jesus seems to be, right, when we put the Gospel of John bring the Gospel of John into the picture, Jesus is connected with that group there, right? And when Jesus, according to the other Gospels, goes into Galilee, shows up in Galilee and starts calling people to follow him, it's after John is imprisoned. And it's the same people in a lot of cases that we meet in John's Gospel as part of John's movement. And so we can then understand the story Mark is telling is not about Jesus encountering people for the first time and saying, follow me, and they just drop everything, but regrouping John's followers and stepping into the role of leader of this movement that John had started. And if we think about discipleship, following someone, John talked about the coming one as one who comes after him, right, which is the language of discipleship. And so saying that stronger one will emerge from among my followers. And so I think that viewing the relationship in those terms actually does help us make sense of the relationship as we see it in the pages of Scripture.
Yeah. I mean, that's good stuff. I know everybody needs to see your book. I can't just keep asking about John the Baptist because then, yeah. And I just want to point out, we did some more yin yang in here. I don't know if people noticed. We still hid some Taoism in here of like, yeah, you need the history and the text. You got that push and pull there. And you got the John the Baptist and Jesus kind of, which a lot more could be said about all that. But when we're talking about like history and the story, one of the things that stood out to me recently, ironically, it was on an episode of Systematic Ecology. We were reviewing a Poison Ivy comic. It was me and Josh Patterson, another mutual friend. And Josh Patterson brought up how comics can do like what Paul Tillich talks about with symbols, and how sometimes our religious symbols today seem to be failing us. And I think the story of Jesus is one of those where, like, for me, it's still powerful. It's a good symbol. But sometimes because of what people have associated the meaning to, it means something other than what the story actually is, right? Which I think history might be able to maybe restore some of these symbols. But I kind of just want to get your take on that. Like how does this idea of like Paul Tillich's symbol, it's not just something that's like representing something. A symbol participates in that which it points to, right? So it's different than a sign. How do you think all of this, like the difference of history and the biblical story, like how does that, play a part in this idea of like symbolism and whether or not these religious symbols are still worth anything today?
I find Paul Tillich's work so incredibly helpful, and so highly recommend it. And when it comes to history and narrative history and theology, history is just one of the sets of things that we can and should ask, but it can inform our efforts to engage in theological reflection. And when we think about John the Baptist, Jesus, the relationship between them, what historical study can do is remind us that there were people who encountered John and Jesus and did not find them persuasive, right? That they were encountering real human beings who were not walking around like with a glowing halo and, walking an inch above the ground and, whatever else. And that was the starting point. Right? And sometimes doctrines about Jesus have been formulated that whenever the conviction that God is encountered in and through the life of Christ is in tension with his historical human life, the humanity is downplayed or tossed aside, right? And so work on this, I think, is important to how Jesus functions as a symbol, right? As a pointer to, because Jesus is the, in the words of the New Testament authors, right? The image of the invisible God, right? It essentially is not just symbol, but almost idol or icon, right? That brings God close, right? In and through this life but in turn functions as a sort of symbol, a pointer, a sacrament, if you will, pointing towards this transcendence. And for Christians, at least, that's how our experience of Jesus tends to be. And yet, if we lose the anchor of the historical Jesus, then there's a real possibility that the symbol becomes emptied of that which got it started and gave it meaning initially, so that Jesus then becomes a blank banner, right, that just about any club, just about any movement can use for diverse purposes, and sometimes purposes that are antithetical to the teaching of the historical Jesus. And so that's one of the ways I think that history can play a useful role, as we engage in sort of symbolic theological reflection.
Yeah. Which, gets to the unity part of all this is like, if we have that history, we can better know what it is we're saying we're united around, Mm-hmm. And we're getting near the end. But I think of when we're talking about Paul Tillich still, he talks about how part of the courage to be is to see that everything is connected, right? Like I can't exist on my own. Like even just like physically, my cells are made up of other things, and I'm not physically made of the same things I was like a few years ago, even, So he talks about how part of the courage to be is just kind of understanding who you are in light of your relationships, because I'm not me without, my relationship to you or TJ or everybody else. And I'm probably soldering it. I'm not a scholar of any sort, but when I think of like your books on how Jesus might not have been Jesus without John the Baptist, well, whatever we mean when we say that God became man and he had all the same experiences of man, well, part of being man is being defined by your relationships. So I feel like that makes perfect sense. And that's going to lean into what a character I'm fascinated by is the brother of Jesus, James, which might make Catholics upset at me, but I would love to do what you do with John the Baptist with James one day, because I find him so fascinating. Some of the like the historical stuff of like how even what happened to him might have been part of why Jerusalem fell. And I'm like, oh, man, it's just so interesting. If I did want to do what you do, but with James, how do we do what you do? Like, you know what I mean? Like if a layperson's listening and they want to do like a deep dive on the history of somebody, but they can't like travel the world to do archaeology and they don't have like access to like a big college, how do we do this kind of historical study that you do?
Yeah. I think pretty much any historian working on any topic, we're all, on the one hand, there is this general knowledge without which one can very badly misunderstand or distort what's happening. And we see this in some of the popular views you get online, people who are like, Jesus was invented by the Romans to try to control the Jews, and all kinds of wacky theories that just have no historical plausibility if you know the time, the place, the sources. And so getting yourself well informed is just generally is important. But then each of us who does this sort of detailed work is dependent on others, right? There's Jewish history and Roman history. There's archaeology. I have never taken the spade and dug things out myself that I have then written about, right? Whether I have written some things that talk about archaeological evidence, but I was not the one who unearthed it. And so each of us is dependent on others. And so one thing I love about scholarship is that it actually at its best is not unlike what church canon should be, where we're all seeking the truth and we're each individually responsible to make up our own minds, but we're not independent in doing so. And we're more likely to get at the truth if we both stand on one another's shoulders, but also are open to being challenged by others. And when we stop that, we stop genuinely questing, or at least effectively questing for truth and questing for God. And so for some, scholarship and faith are, seem to be at odds with one another, whereas for me, these two things at their best function in very similar ways.
Yeah. No, I like that. Oh, man. Well, as we are getting near the end here, is there anything else that you think people absolutely should know or might just be really interested to know about you, John the Baptist, or this book that we're talking about today? That's John of History, Baptizer of Faith, Baptist of Faith, sorry, The Quest of the Historical Baptizer. I was like, I feel like I mixed up a word. I knew I did. Yeah. But is there anything else they should know about you, the book, or just John the Baptist in general before we?
If you're a general reader and not like an academic in my field, then definitely get Christmaker and start there, because that's the one. I tell stories about visiting places associated with John in the Holy Land, talk about things, paint the big picture. It's an accessible book. It's a readable book. Had lots of people tell me that. And then what I recommend is, if you want more, right? You want more detail. You have questions, or how did he figure this out? Or some of the things that are not in there, such as, so what's the connection between John and, say, the Lord's Prayer? What else is there from other strands of Christianity that may tell us something about John as somebody who prayed and taught others to do so? Then academic books can be expensive. Ask your local public library to get it. They almost certainly will. And that's something you should do regularly. If you have an author you appreciate, or a subject that you're interested in, recommend books to your public library. That doesn't get said often enough. Often people don't know that if you have a library card, you can sometimes get ebooks like right on your phone from there. But you can also, usually through the public library website, recommend books for purchase. And so if you want to support the work that I do without it costing you something yourself, then have your local public library get the book and then check it out from there. That actually, because academics, as a rule, don't write books to make money. They are not big money makers. We do it because we think we have something worth saying, something interesting. We find a topic really important and exciting and want to share this love of it and what we've discovered with others. And so I'm much more interested in people reading it. And so library is what I would say is the sort of last point.
Yeah. No, and that helps twofold, because then it also gets the book in other people's hands, because it's in the library now. Yeah. No, that's great. I wish I had thought of that more. I'm going to start recommending that with all of my favorite, like, that I get people on. Nick Polk comes on and talks about his book. I'm going to say, hey guys, you guys should get this in the library. Oh man. Well, it's been a joy. It's always a joy talking to you, James. But before we wrap up, one thing we always like to do, and this isn't as directly related to some of the stuff that we talked about as sometimes this question can be, but if you had to just leave our listeners with a single tangible action, just something practical that they could do that would help better engender Christian unity today, what's one thing that you think people could do right now? So because I teach Sunday school, and I'm part of a not just a denomination that's quite diverse theologically and ethnically and in other ways, but I'm part of a congregation where there's a lot of diversity, like moderate, but with some liberals and some conservatives and the whole spectrum. We wrestled with this question: what does unity mean? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What unites us? And it was in that context that I thought about the fact that there are two approaches to unity. One is to sort of police the boundaries and try and draw the borders of you versus everyone else very strictly. And the other is to have a shared focus. And we realize that that's the kind of unity that we have and that we're striving for, that each of us, the one thing we can all say we share in common in my church is that we are seeking to follow Jesus. We're seeking God. And that may lead us in slightly different directions at the time. And we respect one another and care about one another enough to both allow that you might be headed in a different direction, and I shouldn't just say, well, you should be kicked out because you're moving a different direction than I am. I must be right and you must be wrong. But also care enough about one another and respect one another enough to have that conversation. Say, yeah, so why do you think that way? Because I think about this way. And so having a unity that is defined by the center towards which we're working and around which we're focused, rather than by boundary definition, is, I think, a much healthier model and a more authentically Christian one, because then it keeps the effort to follow Jesus, being a disciple of Jesus, at the center of it all. Man, that might be my favorite answer this ever. Wow. I don't usually like to elaborate, but I think this is helpful. So I just talking from personal experience, I've kind of experienced that, and this is like from back when I was more traditionalist and I was kind of not as informed about a lot of things. So I was kind of dumb. I'll just be honest. I remember I had Christians who came beside me who I didn't agree with, who, like, for me, I was drawing all these boundaries and they were like, you don't need those. But what they saw is that I genuinely loved Jesus. And for me, I was convicted that all these different things were sins that they didn't agree with, but they still would come beside me and they would even help me avoid those things because they're like, they don't think it's a sin, but hey, if you're going to feel guilty for it, I don't want you to do this, man. And that genuine care, I think, is what eventually led me to realize it's not about the boundaries and it is about that focus. So having that focus can even help people maybe drop some of the boundaries. I don't know. That's part of what helped me. So I don't know. That really spoke to me. Glad you said that. How, on more of a macro scale, how do you think if people did that, what do you think we would see change in our churches and the world around us?
Well, I think that we might see at least slightly less splintering of Protestant denominations, because if it's all about boundaries, all right, and I think there is a place, for saying we're not pulling in the same direction, we should go our separate ways. But I think that we might do it less, or we might do it with less animosity and hostility if we recognize that we don't always have to be aligned on everything, right? There's that famous statement that about in essentials unity, right, and non-essentials charity or whatever it is, or in all things charity, and everybody seems to agree with that, but then they disagree about what is or isn't essential, right? And if we make God and Jesus essential within the framework of Christianity, then that means that everything else is something that it's appropriate to look closely at. And if we disagree, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because one or the other has stopped following Jesus or something like that.
Yeah, man, it's good stuff. I seriously, I could just talk to James forever, I think. But this has been a long episode. I don't know if he was prepared for this. So thank you for sticking with me. As we wrap up, we do just share a God moment that we've seen, God in something recently, challenge, blessing, whatever. Mine's a little bit of both. I'll go first, give you time to think. My car decided to stop working. And the code that popped up, it turned out it was like the second cylinder, whatever. Y'all don't need the details. We changed one thing that they said was the cheapest fix. It turned out to not to be that. So then they said it was going to be this really expensive fix. And I was like, man. So I called my mechanic. I was like, here's what they said it's probably going to be. This stinks. And he's like, man, don't do that. Do this thing real quick first. It's like literally less than a fourth of the cost. And I was like, okay, yeah, we'll try that real quick. So it was a third thing that wasn't either of the options that they told me. And this mechanic, who absolutely could have just charged me a buttload of money to do the really expensive thing, told me to do it myself. I was like, just try this really cheap fix, and it worked out. And I'm blessed because of that, and then also challenged of like, do I have that heart where like I could make a bunch of money off of somebody, but instead I'm like, hey man, this will be way better for you, try this. I hope I do. Either way, I'm writing him a Christmas letter and still gonna try and send him some money, because like, I'm talking like, you say it'd be a ton of money with just a little bit of time on the phone. So big challenge, big blessing. James, where have you seen God at recently in your life?
I think I'll just say Theology Beer Camp. That is just an amazing. Yeah, we had an
epic Lord of the Rings liturgy.
Yeah, I mean that was great, and being able to bring my son into this thing. But the truth is that it's a place that is genuinely there's a unity about it, right? Connected with the search for God, seeking to know God and to deepen our experience of God. Following Jesus, and it's precisely that kind of thing that it sounds so frivolous, right? Especially when you see some of the advertising materials and stuff like that. And yet the two times, I've only been twice, but each time it's been this profoundly, authentically Christian, spiritually deep experience for me. And so I think it's a wonderful example of the fact that, as your podcast also indicates, silliness and seriousness are not antithetical, right? When you can't appreciate a certain level of silliness about something, you're probably not taking it seriously. You're probably either afraid of it or something else, right? If it's genuinely become sort of the heart of who you are, and you're seeking to be humble, as we see John the Baptist and Jesus being, then being a bit silly and even self-deprecating has its place.
Oh yeah. I C.S. Lewis, when he talks about sex, he says we take it too seriously, and then he does like an asterisk. He's like, or maybe with the wrong kind of seriousness. So I think that's probably applicable in a lot of different places. And I've shared here before. there was a shooting at my house right after Theology Beer Camp this year. And then right after that was the election. And it was just so interesting which group of Christians, which was mostly from Theology Beer Camp, who immediately were there for me in my time of need, which ones weren't. And then also how that directly overlaid to which ones were upset about stuff I said about the election or not. Just kind of like, I kind of feel like I know which ones have more of the heart of Christ here. It's not the ones that are super serious. So yeah, no, I like that. That's I love Theology Beer Camp and all you guys that I've met through it. It's just been great getting to know everybody. But we are wrapping up now. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, listeners, for sticking with us. I know we went a little bit long, but I love talking to James, and these were just fun, good topics to go over. So we hope you did enjoy it. If you did, consider sharing it with a friend, enemy, or cousin. I don't usually do the wrap up, so I'm struggling here. Bear with me. Again, you do that one-time donation if you don't feel like subscribing. Captivate makes it really easy to just give us like $3 or something if you just want to support the show. Every little bit helps because we're poor. Also check out the other shows on the Zal Podcast Network. I mentioned before, Kung Fu Pizza Party, Christian Ashley. We talk about him a lot. He's my favorite Southern Baptist. We talk about Southern Baptist a lot today. I have a few that I really love. Christian's one of them, and he does the podcast Let Nothing Move You. And he does do a more literalist interpretation of the Bible, but he's not a jerk about it. So maybe check that out. And if you want a more progressive interpretation of the Bible, we also have the Bible After Hours as part of our network with a foul-mouthed preacher. And that's also a fun one. So yeah, we hope you enjoyed it. We hope you enjoy some of those other shows. Next week, we're going to be joined once more by Dr. Tom Ord, also from Theology Beer Camp, to discuss some of our differences of opinions around using the language of mystery of God. So hopefully TJ is there with us then, because me and Dr. Ord see things a little bit differently, and I think TJ would be a good moderator. After that, we're going to be joined by Father Jonathan Resmini once more with Nick Polk as well. And we're going to be discussing some of the different ideas people have around original sin. Father Jonathan is an Orthodox, so they've never really had to deal with original sin. And Nick and I grew up with it and kind of think that it's dumb. But we're also trying to get Professor Chris Moreland, who is a Catholic. So we'll get hopefully a little bit of variety of views there. After that, Eric Nevins, the founder of the Christian Podcasters Association, is going to be joining us again to discuss the state of podcasts, or specifically Christian podcasts, in 2024. Finally, at the end of season 1, Francis Chan will be on. He doesn't know that, though, so someone has to tell him. I don't know how long season 1 will last, probably forever. But Francis, we're waiting for you. If Francis Chan passes before the show goes on, we're just going to wait for his ghost. Season 1 won't end. I hope you guys have figured out that bit by now, and if you haven't, I don't know, I apologize. We've been doing this a long time. But hey, thank you guys again, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Whole Church Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Remember, you can always sponsor our efforts to educate and unite the church on Captivate, Patreon, or Apple Podcast. If you're not into the subscription thing, again, you can leave a one-time tip on our Captivate website down below in the description notes. Thank you again, and please come back next week.